Good day, ladies and gentlemen. When we talk about extremism, we often think of distant history, of uniforms, flags, and parades that belong to another time. We imagine the past as something sealed off, as though the lessons of the 20th century were safely archived in books and museums. But history doesn't stay quiet. The methods, the mindsets, and the manipulations that once fueled totalitarian regimes continue to echo through the modern world, only now they wear different clothes and they speak in different languages. This afternoon, we're not talking about the rise and fall of a single regime. We're talking about a process, how ideas harden into ideology, how ideology becomes identity, and how identity, when weaponized, becomes violence. In the 1930s, Germany gave us one of the most studied examples of ideological radicalization in history. The Nazi Party did not seize power through force alone. It built its empire on persuasion, on propaganda, and on the systemic conditioning of ordinary citizens. Through education, mass media, and ritualized politics, it taught people not just what to believe, but how to think and whom to hate. Today, our world is wired differently, but the underlying dynamics are eerily familiar. Instead of state-run radio, we have social media algorithms. Instead of Gestapo's centralized surveillance, we have data tracking and online echo chambers. Instead of leaflets and posters, we have memes, hashtags, and viral outrage. Extremism has not disappeared, it has adapted. In fact, in many ways, it has become more subtle and more pervasive. Because while the symbols may change, the psychology does not. Every radical movement, whether political, religious, or cultural, depends on the same human vulnerabilities: fear, belonging, resentment, and the yearning for clarity in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. If we are to understand extremism today, we must first understand its structure, the architecture of persuasion that made the 20th century such a dark mirror for human behavior. That is why we begin not with the modern, but with the historical, because the playbook has already been written. It's just being revised. When historians study the rise of Nazi Germany, they often emphasize political failure, the economic depression, the Treaty of Versailles, the fragile democracy of the Weimar Republic. But behind those conditions was something more deliberate, a campaign of indoctrination that transformed frustration into fanaticism. The Nazi model of indoctrination was not spontaneous. It was systemic. It began in schools, in art, in newspapers, and in film. It was in the textbooks that rewrote history, in the posters that linked patriotism to purity, and in the speeches that blurred fact with faith. Adolf Hitler understood that to control a nation, you first had to control its imagination. So, from the very beginning, the Nazi Party invested heavily in propaganda, not as a supplement to policy, but as the foundation of it. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, once said, "We do not talk to say something, we talk to obtain a certain effect." Every word, every image, every broadcast was designed to shape emotion before thought could intervene. Children were among the first targets. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls replaced independent clubs and civic organizations. These programs blended physical training with ideological conditioning, teaching loyalty to the Führer as a sacred duty. By the time these children reached adulthood, many could no longer separate national identity from party allegiance. Adults were not exempt. The regime exploited economic fear, social division, and resentment toward modernity. Newspapers were censored, opposing voices silenced. Gradually, the boundaries of truth began to dissolve. Reality itself became a tool of the state. This transformation did not require every citizen to be a believer. It only required that most of them stop asking questions. Silence was not an accident. It was the outcome of fatigue, fear, and repetition. And this, perhaps, is the most chilling part of the Nazi indoctrination model: its efficiency. It didn't depend on brute force alone. It depended on participation, on millions of small acts of compliance, each justified as self-preservation or patriotic duty. When we look back, It's easy to ask, how could they? But the harder question, and the one most relevant to us today, is could we? Because indoctrination is never only a matter of history, it's a method, and methods can be copied. To understand why people succumb to extremist movements, we have to look beyond politics and into psychology. Ideology alone rarely converts anyone. It's emotion, not argument, that makes belief contagious. The Nazis understood this instinctively. They built a community before they built a nation. The rallies, the uniforms, the chants, they weren't just for spectacle. They created belonging. Each person who marched in step felt part of something larger than themselves. Something that promised order, meaning, and identity in a world that seemed chaotic and unfair. Psychologists have long studied this phenomenon. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch demonstrated how easily individuals conform to group opinion, even when the opinion is clearly wrong. Later, Stanley Milgram showed that ordinary people will obey authority figures to the point of harming others, not because they're inherently cruel, but because obedience feels safer than dissent. The architecture of group identity relies on two emotions, fear and belonging. Fear isolates us. Belonging promises to protect us from that fear. Together, they form a trap that extremists exploit perfectly. Once a group defines an enemy, fear sharpens focus. The world simplifies into us and them. Nuance becomes dangerous. Doubt becomes betrayal. Over time, moral reasoning erodes. People stop evaluating actions, they justify them through loyalty. In Nazi Germany, this meant blaming all national hardships on outsiders, Jews, communists, intellectuals, and degenerates. Today, extremists across the spectrum use similar techniques, vague conspiracies, selective outrage, and slogans that demand allegiance instead of understanding. The language changes, but the logic doesn't. Social media has magnified this psychology. Algorithms reward emotion, especially anger and fear, because outrage keeps us clicking. We now live inside digital echo chambers where repetition replaces reasoning and validation replaces truth. We are not shouted at by a dictator, we are gently nudged by design. Modern indoctrination doesn't need rallies. It only needs engagement metrics. The genius and danger of this system is that it feels voluntary. People radicalize themselves, step by step, through exposure and affirmation. Like in the 1930s, they are promised purpose, identity, and belonging. And like before, they are told that dissent is the enemy. History shows us that the mechanics of control evolve, but the psychology of obedience stays the same. Understanding that is the first defense against it. When we talk about extremism in the 21st century, we often imagine it's something happening elsewhere, in foreign conflicts or shadowy online spaces. But the truth is, radicalization today is domestic, digital, and decentralized. The propaganda machine that once required printing presses and state control now fits in your pocket. Unlike the totalitarian systems of the past, modern extremism doesn't always come from above. It emerges from networks, loose, adaptive, and self-reinforcing. A tweet here, a video there, a community forum filled with anger or fear. Each message feeds the next. Over time, ideology spreads not as a doctrine, but as a mood. This is one of the most significant shifts in how extremism operates. In Nazi Germany, control of the narrative was top-down, dictated by a ministry and enforced through censorship. Today, control is crowdsourced. People seek out the stories that confirm their biases, and algorithms help them find more of the same. The result is fragmentation, countless echo chambers where truth becomes relevant, relative, and outrage becomes currency. Conspiracy theories thrive because they offer simple explanations in a complex world. They transform confusion into conviction, and conviction feels powerful. We see this across ideological lines, from violent nationalist movements to extremist factions that claim moral or political purity. Each insists that the other side is not just wrong, but evil. That framing, moral absolutism, is precisely what allows extremism to flourish. Once opponents are dehumanized, compromise becomes betrayal, and violence becomes justification. In that sense, we've entered a new era of propaganda, one that no longer depends on centralized control but on emotional contagion. Extremism has become viral, and yet there's something else happening beneath the surface. Many who fall into radical movements today are not inherently hateful. They're disoriented. They feel unheard, unseen, or powerless. The same social conditions that made 1930s Germany vulnerable, economic uncertainty, cultural anxiety, and loss of trust in institutions, echo through our own time. If we strip away the symbols and slogans, the emotional landscape is remarkably similar. Fear of decline, nostalgia for an idealized past, and anger at elites or outsiders who seem to stand in the way. Technology amplifies these emotions, but it didn't create them. It only accelerated what was already there, a deep human need for identity in an age of fragmentation. So when we ask how extremism survives in modern democracies, the answer is not that it reemerges from nowhere. It evolves because the conditions that make people vulnerable to it, fear, confusion, isolation, are universal and enduring. If the 20th century showed us how ideology can enslave a nation, the 21st is showing us how it can enslave a mind, one screen at a time. If the previous century's propagandists mastered the loudspeaker and the printing press, today's power brokers of persuasion have mastered something far more intimate: attention. In the 21st century, control over information doesn't mean silencing dissent. It means drowning it out. Modern media ecosystems, whether corporate news networks or social media feeds, operate not on truth, but on engagement. And engagement, as every algorithm knows, is driven by emotion. Anger spreads faster than analysis. Outrage outperforms objectivity every time. This is the new economy of misinformation. Attention is currency, and fear is its most reliable generator. Let's take a step back and recall how Nazi propaganda worked. The regime simplified moral choice. Germany was pure, the enemy was evil, complexity was the enemy of conviction. Every newsreel, every speech, every classroom lesson reinforced that simple binary: us versus them. Now, look around at today's information landscape. Though the language and symbols differ, the psychological architecture remains the same. Social media posts and cable news segments often frame political conflicts as moral absolutes, not differences of opinion, but battles between good and evil, patriots and traitors, justice and corruption. This process, called moral framing, is powerful because it bypasses reasoning and appeals directly to emotion. When a claim feels morally right, it feels true, even when it isn't. That's why misinformation spreads so effectively. It doesn't need to be factually correct. It only needs to affirm our sense of virtue. Both the political left and right fall prey to this dynamic. Each side claims the mantle of righteousness and paints the other as existentially dangerous. The result is not dialogue but moral panic, a society perpetually mobilized for ideological war. Here's where the parallel to extremist indoctrination becomes clear. In Nazi Germany, moral certainty was a tool of control. It unified people through hatred of a common enemy. In our time, moral certainty fragments us, yet it serves the same purpose: to keep people emotionally invested and politically predictable. And the media, often unintentionally, amplifies this division. Consider the 24-hour news cycle. Every crisis becomes a countdown, every headline an alarm. Viewers are not informed, they're conditioned. We become less capable of distinguishing between a scandal and a tragedy, between a disagreement and a threat. The structure of digital communication compounds this problem. When the news is delivered through personalized feeds, people inhabit separate realities. Algorithms act as silent editors, showing each user a world that confirms their existing beliefs. This is confirmation bias by design, a form of psychological manipulation that requires no censorship, only customization. In effect, the same techniques used in totalitarian propaganda, repetition, emotional appeal, and selective information, have been democratized. Everyone can be a propagandist now, often without realizing it. And so we find ourselves at a paradoxical moment. We have more access to information than any generation before us. And yet, as a society, we may understand less. We are overstimulated but underinformed, morally confident but factually uncertain. The danger is not merely misinformation itself, but the erosion of shared reality. When truth becomes tribal, democracy becomes fragile. And the line between persuasion and indoctrination, the very line that once defined the difference between a free people and a controlled one, begins to blur. As we reach the final part of our discussion, it's worth pausing to ask a difficult question. If indoctrination, whether Nazi, ideological, or digital, is so effective, what hope do we have of breaking its grip? The answer begins not with governments or corporations, but with individual responsibility. Because indoctrination, at its core, thrives on passivity. It feeds on the citizen who accepts without questioning, who reacts without reflection, who scrolls instead of studies. To resist that, we must reclaim the habits of critical thought, and we must teach them as urgently as we once taught literacy. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe faced this same challenge. The defeat of Nazism was not just military, it was intellectual. Teachers, philosophies, and policymakers understood that if Germany's next generation grew up unexamined, history would repeat itself. The solution was a radical investment in civic education, not propaganda of the opposite kind, but training in how to think, not what to think. Today, we need a modern equivalent. In an age where manipulation is measured in pixels and contagion, education must go beyond facts and dates. Students must learn how algorithms shape their perception, how to evaluate sources, how to separate moral rhetoric from moral reasoning. That's not just an academic skill, it's a survival skill in a democracy. But education alone isn't enough. Resistance also requires courage. The willingness to speak against our own side when it crosses lines of decency or truth. Totalitarian movements succeed because they train people to remain silent in the face of the absurd. They normalize the unacceptable by making dissent socially dangerous. Sound familiar? Today, many people self-censor, not because of government censorship, but because of social backlash. They fear losing jobs, friends, or reputations if they question prevailing narratives. That's not tyranny in the classical sense, but it's a culture of conformity, and it's just as corrosive to a free society. Breaking that cycle demands not only critical minds, but also moral independence. We must relearn the value of saying, I don't know and I disagree. We must rediscover the humility to question even what we feel most certain about. The third and final piece is institutional. Democracies must treat information integrity as a matter of national security, because it is. This doesn't mean censorship. It means transparency and accountability. Media organizations, social platforms, and political movements must be held to ethical standards that prioritize truth over outrage, context over clicks. There's precedent for this. In post-war Germany, the press was rebuilt under strict journalistic codes: accuracy, verification, public service. Those norms helped inoculate society against future demagogues. We need that same ethic of responsibility in our own institutions, especially in an era where information can be weaponized in seconds. Let me close with this thought. Extremism, in any form, is not an accident of history. It's a recurring temptation. It promises clarity in a complex world, belonging in an isolated age, certainty in uncertain times. But these comforts come at the price of our freedom to think. The only true antidote to indoctrination, left, right, or digital, is not more control, but more consciousness. It's a society of citizens who can see through the slogans, who can spot manipulation when it hides behind virtue, who can resist not with violence, but with understanding. Education sharpens the mind, responsibility strengthens the character, and resistance, the quiet, stubborn refusal to believe without thinking, preserves the soul of a free people. That is how we break the cycle, not through outrage or algorithms, but through awareness, courage, and conscience.